Orson Vickery leaned across his counter and let his eyes drag slowly up and down Elowyn Pike's body, the kind of look designed to make a person feel like something stuck to the bottom of a boot. "You again." His voice carried across the whole store. Two men near the back stopped what they were doing. "Tell me, girl, how much flour does it actually take to keep all of that moving through the winter?" He laughed. They laughed. Elowyn set her bundle of pelts on the counter, didn't look at him, didn't answer. "She's going to freeze up there," Orson said to the men, not even bothering to lower his voice. "First hard snow, she'll come waddling back down that mountain crying for help. Mark my words." She took her flour. She took her salt. She walked out the door. And not a single person in Coldwater Hollow could have imagined what she was walking back to. If you've ever been written off by someone who should have known better, this story is for you. Subscribe and stay with me until the very end, because what happens in the final chapter is something I still can't stop thinking about. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The orphan house matron didn't even invite her inside. That was the part Elowyn Pike remembered most clearly, even a full year later. Not the walk down from the ridge in the cold. Not the way her boots had worn through at the left heel and rubbed a raw strip of skin all the way up her Achilles. Not even the smell of the place. Wood smoke, boiled cabbage, something damp underneath it all. What she remembered was standing on the porch, 17 years old, with everything she owned rolled into a canvas pack on her back, and the matron, a thin, severe woman named Mrs. Aldridge, looking at her the way a person looks at a problem they don't want to solve. "We're full," Mrs. Aldridge said. Elowyn waited. There was usually a but, a however, some kind of next sentence that turned the first one into something manageable. There wasn't one. "The rooms are at capacity." Mrs. Aldridge pulled her shawl tighter. "I'm sorry, but there's nothing I can do." Elowyn looked past her into the hallway. Through the narrow gap in the door, she could see a boy of maybe 9 sitting at a table doing something with a piece of string. He was the only person visible. The hallway behind him looked empty enough to swallow sound. She didn't say anything about that. She didn't argue. She had learned early that arguing with people who had already decided something was a particular kind of exhausting that didn't pay for itself. "All right," she said. She turned around and walked back down the porch steps. She walked back through Coldwater Hollow with the canvas pack cutting into her shoulder and a ruined boot chewing at her heel. Past the blacksmith. Past the general store where a woman in a good coat stopped talking to her friend long enough to look at, Elowyn, the way you look at weather you don't want to get caught in. Past the church and the mill and the small cluster of houses at the north end of town where children were playing some kind of chasing game in the mud. Nobody stopped her. Nobody asked where she was going. That was the thing about being the size Elowyn was, and she had known this for years, had carried it as its own kind of knowledge. People either stared or they looked through you entirely. There wasn't much in between. The ones who stared were at least honest about it. The ones who looked through you were telling you something too, something they maybe didn't even know they were saying. They were telling you that you didn't quite register as a full category of person who might need something or be going somewhere or have reasons for the things you did. She walked north through town and then up along the trail that got less like a trail the higher she climbed, until the settlement below her was just smoke and the distant sound of hammering, and then nothing at all. The cave entrance was a crack in the rock face that a person of average size might have squeezed through without thinking much of it. For Elowyn, it had taken 3 careful attempts on her first day to figure out the exact angle that worked. After that, it was just a motion, like a key in a lock. Sideways, left shoulder forward, chin tucked. She could do it with her arms full now. Inside the cave was dark in the way caves are dark. Not the dark of a room with curtains drawn, but something older, with a weight to it. She had learned to move in it without a torch in the first week, to know the shape of the place through her feet and her hands, to trust the sound of water in the back chamber as a kind of compass. Bracken was already up off the floor before she was fully inside. The dog was lean and gray, built low to the ground with a long head and ears that could catch a sound from the next valley over. He pressed his nose against her hand and then her hip, and then he stood there with his tail making one slow arc back and forth, reading her. "I know," she said. She set the pack down against the wall where the floor was flattest. Her shoulder ached. She rolled it in the socket and felt something pop in a way that wasn't quite painful but wasn't quite right either, that particular category of feeling that a body develops after enough weight and repetition. She sat down on the low flat rock she used as a chair. She had found it wedged in the back chamber and dragged it out over the course of an afternoon, stopping to rest more times than she had wanted to, and she pulled off her boot and looked at her heel. It wasn't bad, a little raw. She had some salve in the pack, a small clay jar of it that she'd traded 2 rabbit skins for in September. She worked it into the skin with her thumb while Bracken put his long face in her lap and looked up at her with his pale eyes. "Orson Vickery," she said. The dog blinked. "He said I'd be waddling back down the mountain crying." She kept working the salve in. "He said it loud enough so everyone could hear." Bracken made a sound in the back of his throat. Not quite a whine. "I know." She put the boot back on, wincing slightly. "Me too." She sat there for a moment longer than she needed to, in the dark and the cold of the cave's outer chamber, with the dog's weight against her leg. She allowed herself exactly that. One moment of sitting still with how much it had cost her to walk through that town and back. How much it always cost. That particular toll. And then she stood up, because there was work to do. That had been a year ago. In that year, Elowen had done something that nobody in Coldwater Hollow knew about, because nobody in Coldwater Hollow had thought to look. And nobody had thought to look because they had already decided that a plus-size orphan girl living alone on a mountain was a temporary problem, a footnote, something that would resolve itself through failure within a season or 2. They were going to be very wrong about that. The first thing she had done was go deeper. The crack in the rock face opened into a short passage and then a chamber roughly the size of a large room. But that chamber had a back wall that wasn't entirely a wall. She had found that out on her 4th night, when Bracken had gotten up and walked directly toward it with his nose moving and his tail still, which was the dog's way of saying, "Pay attention." She had put her hand against the rock and pushed in several places until she found the seam. Another passage, narrower than the first, requiring her to turn sideways again and breathe carefully. It opened into a second chamber, and the second chamber was larger and warmer, and from somewhere in its floor came the sound of running water. A spring. Underground, clean, constant. She had sat down right there on the cave floor and put her face in her hands and not cried exactly, but come closer to it than she had in a long time, because she understood what a spring meant. She understood it in her bones, from the winter she never talked about, the winter she had survived as a child with her family already gone, and the cold coming in under every door and through every crack in the snow outside going past the windowsills. And there had been no water, or rather the water had all frozen, and she had eaten snow and understood for the first time in her young life that the world did not owe her survival. That survival was a thing you built. She had started building it here. The timber work took most of that first month. She had learned from her father, before she lost him, how to look at a piece of wood and understand what it wanted to be, which pieces would bear weight and which ones would crack, how to join them without nails you didn't have. She cut small trees from the slope above the cave where they grew close together and thinned each other out, so she was doing the mountain a favor while she did herself one. She dragged them inside in sections. The work was slow and painful, and she had to stop every few hours and let her hands rest. She kept going. She built shelves along the walls of the inner chamber. She built a sleeping platform elevated off the ground where the cold settled at night. She built a low frame for storing firewood that kept it off the damp floor and let air move through it. She built, over the course of 3 weeks and several failures, a simple baffle system in the back of the inner chamber that redirected the cave's natural draft toward the chimney crack she had found in the ceiling, a long, natural fissure in the rock that she cleaned out with a stick and a strip of cloth and confirmed, by holding a flame beneath it, carried smoke up and out of the mountain. That was the day she allowed herself to build a fire inside. The warmth had been almost unbearable. She had not realized how cold she had been until she wasn't. Bracken had pressed himself against the side of the fire ring, a ring of stones she'd arranged on the chamber floor, and made a sound she had never heard him make before. Something low and sustained, not distress, not excitement, something more like relief. "Yeah," she said. "Me too." She found out about the second chimney crack by accident in the 4th month, when she was reinforcing the ceiling above the sleeping platform and noticed a current of cool air moving against her face from above. She tested it the same way, with flame, and confirmed it moved in the opposite direction, pulling air in rather than pushing smoke out. With both passages in use, the cave breathed, genuinely breathed. Smoke up and out through the first crack, fresh air drawn in through the second. It wasn't perfect. Nothing she built was ever perfect. But it worked well enough that she could maintain a small, constant fire in the inner chamber through the night without the air going bad. She stacked firewood in the outer chamber first, where it would stay driest, then expanded into a side alcove she had cleared by moving stones one at a time over the course of 2 weeks. By the time the leaves turned, she had enough firewood stacked to last a normal winter. By the time the first frost came, she had twice that. The food was more complicated. She hunted. She was a fair shot and a better trapper, and the mountain was generous with rabbits and grouse if you knew where to set a line and when to check it. She dried meat over the fire on a rack she built from bent green wood. She salted what she couldn't dry. She made jerky and pemmican by a method her father had shown her once, and she had remembered imperfectly, and had to work out for herself through several batches that went wrong before one went right. She dug a cold pit in the outer chamber's floor, below the frost line, lined it with river stones she carried up in a sack 2 trips at a time, and used it to store root vegetables she traded for at the edge of town. She had learned to go early, before the crowds, and to deal quickly, and leave before Orson Vickery or anyone like him had time to settle in for the day's entertainments. The beans and flour and salt she bought in small amounts each time, storing them in clay jars with tight lids, stacking them on the inner shelves. By October, she had enough to last 6 months if she was careful. By November, she had stretched that estimate to 8. She was almost always calculating. That was the thing about her that the people of Coldwater Hollow had mistaken for slowness or dullness or whatever it was they imagined when they saw her moving quietly through their streets. Not talking much, not hurrying, not reacting to the things said at her expense. She wasn't slow. She was doing arithmetic constantly. How much flour per week? How many trips to be worth the wear on her boots? How many pounds of green wood she needed to dry into usable firewood given its current moisture level and the time she had left before the temperature dropped past the point where drying slowed down. She was always somewhere in those numbers. Bracken understood this about her without needing it explained. The dog had come to her in late spring of the previous year, thin and limping, with a gash along his right flank that had gone a few days without cleaning. She had found him sitting at the cave entrance one morning as if he'd been placed there. She had cleaned the gash with boiled water and bound it with a strip of linen and fed him a piece of dried rabbit, and he had looked at her with those pale eyes and appeared to make a decision. He had been making decisions in her favor ever since. He hunted when she hunted, ranging ahead and flushing game back toward her. He slept against her legs at night, and she had learned to use his body heat as supplementary warmth during the coldest hours in a way she would have been embarrassed to admit to anyone, but which was simply practical. He warned her about weather. This was not a mystical thing. She was clear with herself about that, but a physical one. The dog's senses were calibrated for survival in a way hers weren't quite. He felt pressure changes in his ears before she could see them in the sky. He smelled water before she could hear it. He had saved her from a wrong turn in dense fog one November afternoon by stopping dead in the trail and refusing to go forward, and when she had gone around him and looked, she found the trail dropped off a ledge she would not have survived. She had started watching him instead of the sky when she needed to know what the weather was thinking. By the end of her first full year on the mountain, Elowen Pike had built something that most people twice her age and with 10 times her resources had never managed to build. She had built a home that was actually safe. Not comfortable in any way the people of Coldwater Hollow would have recognized. No curtains, no rug, no painted walls, but safe in the way that actually mattered. Safe against cold and hunger and thirst and collapse and fire and every other specific form of death that the wilderness offered. She had done it alone. She had done it while being mocked every time she came down the mountain for supplies. She had done it while carrying the memory of a winter that had taught her, at an age when she shouldn't have needed to know, that the margin between alive and not was thinner than people who had never stood at it liked to believe. And she had done it while being, by every external measure, the town of Coldwater Hollow was capable of applying nobody. The fat orphan girl with the ugly dog and the strange, quiet way about her, the one who would never survive the winter alone. That was October. By November, the birds had started to go quiet. Elowen noticed it first in the mornings, which was when the mountain was usually loudest. The jays, the nuthatches, the occasional sound of a woodpecker somewhere in the ridge timber. By the second week of November, they were down to almost nothing. No migrating birds either, or rather, the ones that usually pass through on their way south had done so earlier than she had ever seen, moving through quickly as if they knew something about the season ahead that made them unwilling to linger. She stood outside the cave entrance one morning with a cup of water cooling in her hands and listened to the silence and felt it differently than she felt ordinary silence. This had a texture to it, a weight. Bracken was sitting beside her looking north. He had been doing this for 3 days, just sitting and looking north with his ears forward and his nostrils moving. "I see it," she said. She went back inside and started counting. She counted everything. That was the first thing she did when the silence started getting under her skin. She went back inside and she counted. Every jar on every shelf, every piece of firewood in the outer chamber and the alcove, every strip of dried meat on the rack, every measure of flour and salt and beans in their clay containers with their tight-fitting lids. She counted with a short piece of charcoal on a flat piece of pale stone she used as a slate, making marks and then adding them up and then checking the addition twice, because she had learned the hard way that optimism was a thing that crept into arithmetic when you weren't watching. You thought you had more than you did because you wanted to have more than you did. She didn't allow herself that anymore. The numbers, when she finished, were good. Better than good, in the sense that she had planned for a hard winter and the stores reflected that planning. But she stood there looking at the marks on the slate and felt a specific unease that had nothing to do with her own supplies. It was the silence outside that was doing it, the silence and Bracken looking north. She had seen one hard winter in her life, and she had survived it by the thinnest possible margin, and the memory of it lived not in her mind exactly, but somewhere more physical, in her chest, in the back of her throat, in the particular way her hands moved faster when the temperature dropped past a certain point. Her body remembered what her mind sometimes tried to soften. Her body did not soften anything. She went back outside and looked at the sky. It was the color that got her. Not dark, not stormy looking in any ordinary way. Metallic was the word that came to her, though she might have struggled to explain it to someone. Like the sky had been hammered thin over some enormous heat and left to cool into something that only resembled normal sky. The light had no warmth to it, even at midday. Everything it touched looked flattened. Bracken was still looking north. "All right," she said. She wasn't talking to the dog exactly, or she was, but she was also talking to the feeling in her chest, the one she had learned to take seriously. "All right, let's see what we actually need." She went inside and took the slate and started a different kind of counting. Not what she had, what she might need if the winter that was coming was the kind of winter she was starting to suspect it might be. She had seen deer moving down from the high meadows 3 days ago. Not the gradual seasonal drift, but a sudden wholesale evacuation. Every deer she had seen over the previous month gone in a single afternoon, moving fast and low through the timber as if they were running from something they could smell, but she couldn't yet. She had seen squirrels doing something she had never seen squirrels do in late November, going back and adding to nests they had already sealed, breaking them open and restuffing them with additional material, which meant they were expecting worse than they had already planned for, and squirrels, in her experience, were more honest about winter than any instrument or calendar she had ever encountered. She did the math a second time with a longer estimate, stretching her projection by 6 weeks beyond her original worst case. She was short on firewood, not dangerously short, not yet, but shorter than she wanted to be against a 6-week extension. She needed 2 more full loads of timber from the slope above. She also needed to seal the gap in the outer chamber's south wall, a gap she had been meaning to address for 2 months, and had kept deprioritizing because other things needed doing, and the gap was small enough to overlook. She stood in front of it now and held her hand flat against it and felt the air moving through and understood she could not overlook it anymore. And she needed to fill the emergency water containers. She had 3 large clay urns she'd bought over the summer that she kept for the specific purpose of maintaining a reserve in the event that the spring became inaccessible, which it never had, but which she thought about anyway, because the spring fed through a crack in the inner chamber floor, and there was no reason that crack could not, under the right conditions, freeze or shift or be blocked in some other way she hadn't thought of yet. The urns were currently half full. She needed them full. She started with the firewood because it was the most physical, and she wanted to be tired before the cold of the night came in. She took the axe and the rope and the sled she had built from salvaged boards, and she went up the slope above the cave in the flat gray light and started cutting. The work was exactly what it always was. It wasn't romantic. It was cold, and it was loud, and the axe handle raised a blister on her right palm in the first 20 minutes despite the calluses she had built there over the past year. She cut until her arms went heavy, and then she rested, and then she cut more. She loaded the sled, she dragged it down. She stacked the wood in the alcove, fitting the pieces together the way she had learned made the most stable pile. The way certain pieces would support the ones above them, and certain orientations reduced the chance of a collapse that could injure a foot or a leg in the dark. She made 2 full loads before the light failed completely. Her back was punishing her by the time she got the second load stacked. Not a new pain. She had an old strain in the left side of her lower back that she had gotten in the summer during a particularly ambitious timber dragging session, and which had never quite healed because she had never quite rested it enough. It flared hot under her left shoulder blade when she bent wrong or lifted too fast. She had gotten into the habit of taking the load in a slightly different distribution, more weight on the right side of the sled rope, which helped some. She stood in the alcove counting the new wood on top of the old, breathing hard and feeling the pain pulse in her back, and she thought, it's enough. Maybe. If her estimates were right, and her estimates were wrong in the cautious direction and not the optimistic one, maybe. She sealed the wall gap the next morning with a mixture of clay and dried grass she had been using for chinking throughout the cave. It wasn't mortar. It didn't have the permanence of mortar. But it was what she had, and she worked it into the gap with her fingers, pushing it deep and smoothing the surface. And when she pressed her hand flat against the wall, she couldn't feel the air current anymore. She would check it again in a week. She would probably have to reapply it. That was fine. That was what maintenance was. She filled the 3 clay urns from the spring, carrying water in a smaller clay jar and pouring it carefully, not spilling, because every drop that went on the floor was a drop she had carried for nothing. It took most of the afternoon. The urns were heavy when full, too heavy to move without draining them first, and she had positioned them in the inner chamber against the wall near the fire ring where the temperature stayed most consistent. When she finished, she sat on her flat rock and looked at what she had built, and thought about the sky, and thought about the deer, and thought about what was coming. She was ready. She was as ready as she could be. But sitting there in the firelight with Bracken asleep against her ankle, she felt something she didn't have a clean word for. Not fear exactly. Not loneliness. Something in between that maybe didn't have a name because it was too specific. The feeling of being very well prepared for a thing and still not knowing exactly what form the thing was going to take. And knowing that this uncertainty was the one part of the equation she could not eliminate, no matter how many times she counted or how much firewood she stacked. She had been alone on this mountain for a year. In that time, she had come close to real danger twice. Once when the temperature dropped so fast in January that ice formed in the outer chamber before she could get the fire fully banked. And once in March when she had fallen crossing a frozen stream and hit her head hard enough to lose a few minutes and come back to awareness with the cold water soaking through her coat and Bracken standing on her chest barking directly into her face. Both times she had gotten herself upright and dealt with the immediate problem, and then sat with the shaking in her hands for a while afterward, and then continued. Both times there had been no one to tell. That was the particular arithmetic of living alone that no amount of firewood planning accounted for. The small daily maintenance of being fine that you did privately, without witness, without the basic human exchange of, I had a hard day and someone saying, I know. She had Bracken, and she would not minimize what Bracken provided. The dog's company was real and warm, and on the worst nights she was simply grateful for another heartbeat in the cave. But there was a specific deficit that the dog could not fill that she had learned to carry without examining too closely, because examining it too closely didn't help anything. She went to sleep thinking about the sky. She woke up in the morning and it had changed. It was still that metallic color, but there was something added to it now, a density low on the northern horizon. A darkness that wasn't cloud exactly, but was where cloud was coming from. The temperature had dropped overnight, not dramatically, but measurably. She could feel it in the outer chamber, which she hadn't bothered to close off from the entrance passage the night before, and now regretted. She pulled the heavy leather curtain across the passage, and that helped some. Bracken was at the entrance before she even had her boots on. Not yet, she said. He looked back at her. We don't go out there yet. We check everything one more time. She checked everything one more time. She moved through the cave the way she always did it. Outer chamber first, then the alcove, then through the passage to the inner chamber, then to the spring in the back. Every shelf, every jar, Every piece of equipment, the axe, the fire-making kit in its oilcloth pouch, the medical supplies, the salve, the linen strips, the small bottle of something strong enough to clean a wound that she had paid more for than she'd wanted to, the rope, the snow tools she'd put together over the summer, two wide flat boards strapped to wooden frames that served as rough snowshoes, designed not to be elegant but to keep her from sinking past her thigh in deep powder, because at her size and in deep snow, that kind of sinking could exhaust her faster than almost anything else she'd faced on the mountain. Everything was where it should be. She sat down by the fire and ate a measured breakfast. She had been eating at measured levels for 2 months. Not starving herself, nothing like that. Just being deliberate, knowing that the psychological discipline of rationing was something you had to practice before you needed it, so that it felt normal rather than desperate. And she watched the fire and thought about the settlement below. She thought about it without particular tenderness or particular resentment. Both of those were too clean, to be honest. What she felt about Coldwater Hollow was something more complicated and harder to hold. Something like grief mixed with understanding, mixed with a specific cold anger she kept in a well-sealed place and did not take out and look at often because it didn't serve any practical purpose. She thought about the people down there, not as a group, because thinking about them as a group let her dismiss them too easily, and she didn't think that was honest either. She thought about specific people. She thought about the Calloway family, the mother with the 3 young children whose husband had died in a logging accident in the spring. She thought about old Nestor Birch, who was past 70, and who she had watched one afternoon last winter, moving very slowly across the icy main street with a load of wood that was too heavy for him and nobody stopping to help. She thought about the young couple who had moved to Coldwater Hollow in September from somewhere south, who didn't know the mountains and would not have had the time to properly prepare for a winter of any severity, let alone the one she suspected was approaching. She thought about what those people's wood stores probably looked like. She thought about what their roofs probably looked like. She sat with those thoughts for a while, and then she put more wood on the fire and went to sleep, because there was nothing she could do about any of it right now, and staying awake worrying about it would only cost her rest she might need. The storm announced itself 3 mornings later. There was no drama in how it arrived, at least not at first. She woke up to a particular quality of silence, different from the bird silence of the previous weeks, which had been an absence. This was something present, a pressure, low and immense and moving, the way she imagined the ocean would sound if you were underneath it, which she had never been, but which was the comparison that came to her. She pulled on her coat and went to the entrance and looked out. The sky was white. Not cloudy white, but solid white, the kind of sky that meant the cloud and the air had stopped being separate things. The temperature had dropped past anything she had a specific number for. She did not have a proper thermometer, only her body's memory of what different cold felt like against her face. And this was a cold she had felt once before, 11 years ago, and had never forgotten. Bracken came and stood beside her, and they both looked out at the white. "Okay," she said. It wasn't anything more than that. Just okay. Acknowledging the thing that was happening. She went back inside and pulled the leather curtain across the entrance, and then she built the fire up to the level she would keep it at for the duration. Not maximum. She could not afford maximum for any extended period, but the level she had calculated as the minimum necessary to maintain a survivable temperature in the inner chamber while conserving fuel. She had worked out this calculation in August, of all times, sitting in the warmth of a summer evening and running the numbers in a cold-blooded way that had felt almost perverse at the time. Now she was grateful for her own strange summer self, who had done the math while she wasn't desperate. The wind came first. She heard it before she felt it, a sound she could only describe as the mountain learning to groan, a deep frequency vibration that moved through the rock itself before it moved through the air. Then the air. It hit the entrance curtain like a shove, and the curtain billowed inward, and she went and put a heavy stone against the bottom of it, and that helped, but didn't stop the cold that came underneath. She filled the gap at the bottom with a rolled blanket. Better. The ice came after the wind, which she had not expected. She had expected snow first. Instead, she heard what sounded like gravel being thrown against the mountain face outside. Small, hard impacts, rapid and continuous, and understood that it was freezing rain, which was in some ways more dangerous than snow because of what it would do to every surface it touched. Everything outside would be coated in ice within hours. Trails, tree branches, rooftops, stairs and doorways, and the flat surfaces people needed to move on. She thought about the rooftops. She sat by the fire and fed it carefully, and thought about the rooftops of Coldwater Hollow, and the weight of ice, and what that weight would do to structures that were already old or poorly built, or that hadn't been maintained with the specific attention that a bad winter demanded. She thought about the Calloway mother's roof. She had looked at it once when she was in town, without meaning to make a project of it, just the way her mind worked. Assessments, automatically. The center beam had been sagging. Not dramatically, just a little. The kind of sag that was easy to tell yourself was fine until it wasn't. She put another piece of wood on the fire. Outside, the freezing rain turned to sleet. She could hear it differently. Larger, heavier, still icy, but falling with more mass behind it. The sound against the mountain face changed from scattered gravel to something more like a sustained hiss. Bracken had moved to his spot against the fire ring and was lying with his chin on his paws, looking at nothing in particular, which was his meditative mode, the one he went into when there was nothing to do but wait. She had learned to match him when he was in that mode, not to fight the waiting. She ate her measured lunch. She mended a tear in her coat sleeve using a bone needle and heavy thread, doing it by firelight with her head bent close because the firelight wasn't quite enough, and she didn't want to waste a candle on it. The mending took longer than it should have because the tear was in an awkward place at the inner elbow crease, and she had to hold the coat at an uncomfortable angle. Her fingers were stiff from the cold that still came through the walls despite everything, not the biting cold of outside, but the constant deep cold of rock and earth that no amount of fire entirely defeated. She worked the needle through the cloth and pulled the thread through and thought about what was happening below. The sleet lasted through the afternoon and into the night. She banked the fire carefully before she slept. More art than science. The exact configuration of partially consumed and fresh logs that would keep a coal bed alive through the hours without burning through too fast or going out entirely. She had gotten reasonably good at it. Reasonably. She slept in her coat. She woke twice in the night to add wood, and once to move Bracken out of the way of a draft he hadn't noticed was hitting him because he was asleep. The third time she woke, it was because he had woken her. His nose against her face, which was his emergency signal, distinct from his ordinary waking her up pressure, which was his nose against her hand. She sat up. The fire had gone lower than she wanted. Not dangerous, but lower. She fed it quickly, practical movements, no fumbling. Then she listened. The sleet had stopped. In its place was something she felt more than heard, a massive, deep, almost geological movement of air pressing down from somewhere above the mountain. Snow. Real snow. The kind that didn't ask permission. She added 2 pieces of wood to the fire, lay back down, pulled the blanket up, and listened to the mountain begin to disappear under white. In Coldwater Hollow, 3 days into the storm, a roof collapsed. She didn't know about it yet. She was sealed in the mountain, warm and supplied and as prepared as she could be. And below her the settlement was changing shape under the weight of the ice and the snow in ways that none of the confident, comfortable people who had watched her walk through their streets and made their assessments of her were equipped to handle. She found out later, and in the way she found out, everything changed. But that morning, the morning the first roof came down, Elowen Pike was standing in the back of her inner chamber filling her water cup from the spring, watching the clear cold water move through the crack in the floor the way it had moved every morning since she found it. And she was thinking about the Calloway children, and she was doing a calculation she hadn't let herself start yet, because starting it meant committing to a decision she hadn't made. She was calculating how many people the cave could hold. Not comfortably. She gave up comfortable as a variable immediately. Comfortable was not the point. The point was survivable. How many bodies could the inner chamber maintain warmth for, given the fire at its rationed level? How many people could drink from the spring without exhausting it? She had tested its flow rate in the summer, knew roughly how many gallons per hour it produced, had the number in her head. How many people could she feed from her stores for how long at what ration level before the math stopped working? She ran it 3 times. She got 3 different answers because the variables had too many unknowns. She didn't know how many people were in genuine danger. She didn't know the condition of the children or the elderly. She didn't know how much food anyone had managed to bring with them, if they came. But the 3 answers were close enough to each other that she could see the shape of the truth in them. The cave could hold more people than she wanted it to. She stood there with the water cup and felt the weight of that understanding settle on her, the way the snow was settling on the mountain above her. Not all at once, but in a continuous accumulation that was going to reach a certain point, and then simply be what was there, undeniable, something you dealt with or didn't. Outside, the storm was entering its second real day of violence. In Coldwater Hollow, people were starting to understand that they had made a serious mistake, and none of them yet knew that the mistake had a solution, and that the solution was a girl on a mountain they had dismissed as nobody, and that she had known this storm was coming before any of them had thought to pay attention. The first roof came down on the third night. Harlan Weller heard it from across the street, a sound like a single massive exhalation, a crack, and then a long grinding collapse, and then silence that was somehow worse than the sound had been. He had been standing at his own window watching the snow press against the glass with his arms crossed over his chest, which was a thing he had been doing for 2 days in the gradually thinning hope that watching it would make it slow down or stop, which it had not done, and showed no signs of doing. He pulled his coat on and went out. The Calloway house had lost the entire center section of its roof. The snow had piled on top of the already sagging ridge beam, and the beam had done what sagging beams do under sufficient weight. It had given up, and in giving up, it had pulled the rafters inward, and the whole middle of the structure had folded like something being pressed between two palms. The walls were still standing, the ends of the house were still standing, but everything in between was open to the sky, and the snow was already filling the interior with a quiet, indifferent efficiency. The Calloway children were outside. Someone had gotten them out. Martha Calloway herself, most likely, who was standing in the snow in her nightdress and her coat thrown over the top of it with her 3 children clustered against her. The smallest one, a girl of maybe 4, crying in a sustained and breathless way that children that age cry when they have moved past the point of understanding what is happening to them and are simply discharging the feeling. Harlan stood there in the snow and looked at the collapsed roof, and then at Martha Calloway and her children, and then back at the roof. "Come on," he said. "Come into ours." Martha looked at him. Her face was a specific kind of blank that he recognized. The blank of a person who has just seen their problem become so large that the ordinary machinery of decision-making has temporarily stopped working. "Martha," he said her name more firmly. "The children, come on." That reached her. She gathered the smallest one up and took the oldest by the hand and came through the snow toward him. The middle child, a boy of about 7, stopped and looked back at the collapsed house for a moment with an expression on his face that was too old for his age, and then followed his mother. Inside Harlan's house, his wife Agnes took the children without needing to be asked. This was one of the things Harlan had always appreciated about Agnes, her ability to move quickly and without ceremony in a practical crisis, the absolute absence of dithering. She had the children by the fire with blankets around them within 3 minutes and was already heating water. Harlan stood in the middle of his own kitchen and looked around it with new eyes. His roof was fine. He had maintained it carefully, replaced a section of the ridge beam 3 summers ago when he'd seen the beginning of softness in the old wood. His firewood was reasonably stocked. His food stores were not as deep as he would have liked, but adequate for the 2 of them. For 2 of them. With 5 more people in the house, adequate became something different. He went to the window and looked out. The snow was still coming. It had not slowed in any meaningful way in 2 days, and there was nothing about the sky that suggested it intended to. The temperature was doing something he could not remember it doing. It was dropping during the day as well as the night, which was not how bad winters usually worked. Usually there was some daily fluctuation, some brief softening in the midday hours when you could get outside and move and accomplish something. This one wasn't giving them that. It was simply pressing down, consistent and relentless and comprehensive. He started thinking about the other houses in Coldwater Hollow. He had a blacksmith's practical eye for structures, how things were joined, what was carrying load, and what was just hanging there, what had been built to last, and what had been built because it was cheaper and faster, and the person building it had been thinking about other things. He knew every building in the settlement with the kind of knowledge that came from having repaired the ironwork on most of them at one time or another. He knew which ones had good bones and which ones were doing their best, and which ones were, honestly, somewhere between praying and luck. He did not think about prayer. He thought about luck, and understood it was running out. The Miller family's place had a flat section roof over the addition they'd built last summer, He had seen it go up and had said nothing because it wasn't his place to say anything and nobody had asked him. But flat sections in heavy snow country were a bad idea for reasons that were engineering and not opinion. The Petrov family had a woodpile that had looked thin to him in October, and he'd had a moment of thinking he should say something, and then had thought it was none of his business and had moved on. Now it was everyone's business. He pulled on his second coat, the heavier one, the one with the wool lining that Agnes had repaired twice, and which was starting to need a third repair at the right shoulder, and went back out into the storm. He didn't have a plan exactly. He had a direction, which was to find out how bad it was before it got worse, and he had the instinct that had served him throughout his adult life in the blacksmith trade, which was that you looked at the problem directly and clearly before you decided what to do about it, and looking away from it never helped and usually hurt. The settlement was, he searched for the word and settled on diminished. That was it. The storm had diminished Coldwater Hollow in a way that was almost physical, had compressed it, had taken the ordinary dimensions of the place and pushed them inward. The drifts between the buildings were high enough in places to be navigated rather than walked through. The main street, which was usually the most protected corridor in the settlement because of the way the buildings flanked it, had a section near the mill where the snow had piled in a long, angled drift nearly chest-high. He went around it. He checked 6 houses in the next 2 hours. The news was not good. The Miller addition was already showing stress. He could see it in the way the roof line had developed a slight bow that hadn't been there when the storm started, and he had gone inside and looked at the joining beam and told Ed Miller in the plainest terms he knew that the structure needed to be relieved of its snow load before the end of the day, or they were going to be the second roof collapse. Ed had looked at him with an expression caught between offense and fear, and had eventually landed on fear, which was the appropriate response. Ed's brother had gone up with a long-handled broom and had started pushing snow off the roof, which was dangerous work in the current conditions but less dangerous than the alternative. The Petrov woodpile was exactly as bad as Harlan had feared. Vladimir Petrov had met him at the door with the expression of a man who had been trying to decide whether to ask for help for 24 hours and had been repeatedly overruled by his own pride. The pile behind the house was maybe 3 days of proper burning left. In this storm, with these temperatures, that was 3 days, not 6, not a week. 3 days of being warm, and then something that would happen to his family that Harlan did not want to let himself fully picture. He shared some of his own wood. He organized a transfer from the community woodpile at the edge of the mill yard, which was common property maintained by collective labor in better seasons, and which was meant for exactly these situations. The community pile was lower than it should have been. There had been some discussion in September about adding to it before winter, and the discussion had concluded inconclusively, as these discussions sometimes did when everything felt far away enough to address later. Later was now. Harlan stood in the snow between the Petrov house and the community woodpile, and felt, with a clarity that was almost physical, that he was solving small problems around the edges of a large one. The large one was this: Coldwater Hollow was not equipped for what was happening to it. It had not been equipped because the people in it, himself included, he was honest enough to include himself, had looked at their ordinary preparations and believed them to be sufficient without ever genuinely stress-testing that belief. They had been comfortable. Comfortable people made comfortable estimates. He stood there and the snow came down and he thought about what sufficient actually looked like, what it would take to be genuinely safe in a storm of this magnitude rather than merely hoping to outlast it. And that was when he thought of Elowin Pike. It didn't come to him the way a revelation comes in a story, all at once and luminous. It came the way things actually come to you. When you're standing in the snow in the dark, feeling inadequate, gradually, through a series of smaller recollections that added up to something he hadn't consciously assembled before. He remembered watching her in his shop 3-4 months ago, when she had come in to have an axe head reforged. Most people brought in tools for repair because the tools had broken through carelessness or accident. She had brought this axe head in because the eye, the hole where the handle fitted, had worn slightly loose from extended use, and she had noticed before it became a problem and wanted it corrected before it did. That was not how most people maintained their tools. He remembered the specificity of her requests at Orson's store. She didn't come in and look around and buy what caught her eye. She came in with a list, not a written list, but a mental one, clearly itemized. And she worked through it in order, and she asked about quantities in a way that suggested she was comparing them against a target number she already had in her head. He remembered her looking at the sky. This had been in October, when he'd been taking a barrel into the back of the store, and she was outside on the step waiting for Orson to finish with another customer, and he had glanced at her through the window, and she had been standing perfectly still, looking north with an expression on her face he hadn't known what to do with at the time. He knew what to do with it now. She had been reading the sky the way he read metal, looking for the information in it, looking at what was actually there rather than what he hoped was there. She had been prepared. The understanding arrived with enough force that he actually stood still for a moment in the storm and let it arrive fully. She had not been wandering the mountain like a lost girl too stubborn to accept help. She had been building something. She had been up there for a year working on something, and he had never thought to ask what. Because the story he and everyone else in Coldwater Hollow had told themselves about her had left no room for the possibility that she might know something they didn't. He felt the particular discomfort of a man confronting the gap between what he had assumed and what was true, which was an uncomfortable gap, and he did not enjoy standing in it. He also understood that the gap was beside the point now. He went to find Orson Vickery. Orson was in his store, which was closed, but in which he was clearly present because lamplight showed under the door, and Harlan could hear movement inside. He knocked. There was a pause. The movement stopped. And then the door opened, and Orson looked at him with the expression of a man who had been hoping the knock was not going to happen. "How are your stores?" Harlan asked without preamble. Orson's jaw moved. "Fine." "That's not what I asked. I asked how they are." Orson looked at him for a moment and then stepped back from the door. Inside, the store was dimmer than usual. He was conserving lamp oil, which told Harlan something about the state of things. The shelves were not bare, but they were visibly lower than they had been 3 days ago, which meant people had been buying in advance of the storm and also in response to it, and Orson had been selling because selling was what Orson did, without calculating what he would need to keep for himself. Orson crossed his arms over his chest. "I'll be fine." "You keep saying fine," Harlan said. "The Callaway roof came down last night." Orson's expression changed. "I need you to think," Harlan said, "about Elowen Pike." The change in Orson's expression when he said that name was complicated. There was the defensive reflex first, the slight stiffening that came from a person who has said things they are beginning to wish they hadn't said. Then something else moved under it. Not quite guilt. Orson was not, in Harlan's experience, a man who moved quickly to guilt, but something adjacent to it, something that happened when a comfortable story started to crack. "What about her?" Orson said. "She's been up there for a year," Harlan said. "She didn't come down to beg for help at the end of last winter like you said she would. She didn't freeze. She came down to trade, same as always, bought her supplies, went back up." "So? So what has she been doing up there, Orson, for a year, with all those supplies?" Harlan looked at him steadily. "What do you think she's been building?" Orson said nothing. "I've been thinking about this for an hour," Harlan said. "Standing out there in the snow trying to figure out how to keep this settlement from losing more roofs and more people. And I kept coming back to her. The way she looked at the sky. The way she bought things like she knew exactly what she needed and how much. The way she never—" He stopped. He had been about to say something like the way she never seemed worried, but that wasn't quite right. She had seemed worried sometimes, but it had been a specific kind of worry, the productive kind, the kind you turned into action rather than into paralysis. The way she was always calculating something. Orson unfolded his arms and then folded them again, which was a thing he did when he was working through something he didn't want to work through. "You think she has—" He stopped. "I think she has whatever it takes to survive this," Harlan said. "And I think we need to find out." Orson was quiet for long enough that the storm outside filled the silence completely. The wind had found a gap somewhere in the building and was producing a thin, sustained note that was not quite a whistle and not quite a moan, but something between the two that had been going since the previous night and had settled into the background like an accusation you stop hearing because it hasn't stopped yet. "She's not going to help us," Orson said finally. "Not after—" He stopped again. "You don't know that," Harlan said. "And right now I don't have the luxury of worrying about it." He left and went back out into the storm. He found 2 other men willing to go with him. Not easily. The finding took an hour, and the willingness was the conditional, reluctant kind that came with multiple questions and expressions of doubt that he had to push through with a persistence that cost him patience he didn't have a lot of. Caleb Doust, who ran the feed store, and who was a large, quiet man with more practical sense than he usually got credit for, agreed after 3 minutes. Jonas Mack, who was younger and fitter than most, and who had been a trapper before he settled in the hollow, took longer but came around when Harlan pointed out that Jonas knew the mountain trail at least as far as the second ridge, and they needed someone who did. They stood in Harlan's kitchen gearing up. Agnes gave them extra wrappings for their faces and hands without comment. The Calloway children were asleep by the fire. Martha Calloway was awake in the chair beside them, watching the men prepare, and she said nothing, but her eyes said she understood what they were going to try to do, and she wanted them to succeed badly enough that she couldn't put it in words. Orson Vickery came through the door when they were almost ready. Nobody said anything about it. Harlan just nodded at him and handed him a length of rope. The trail up the mountain had ceased to be a trail in any ordinary sense. This was the first thing that became apparent within 10 minutes of leaving the settlement. What Jonas had known as a path, a rough but navigable passage through the timber and up across 2 open slopes to the higher elevation where the cave was supposed to be, or at least where Jonas had once seen the girl coming down from, which was the closest thing to directions any of them had, was now a landscape of snowdrifts and buried obstacles that required constant negotiation. The wind was the worst thing. Not the cold, which was severe enough, and not the snow, which was deep enough. The wind was the thing that turned the whole experience from difficult into something closer to desperate. It came in sustained pushes from the north and northwest alternately, which meant it was always finding your face no matter how you turned, and it carried the dry-top snow with it so that visibility dropped to almost nothing during the gusts, and they had to stop and wait and then move in the windows between them. Jonas led. Harlan came second, Caleb and Orson in the back. They made it to the first open slope and got across it badly. Caleb went thigh-deep into a drift that didn't look as deep as it was, which was a specific mountain snow deception that Harlan recognized too late to warn him about, and getting him out cost them 5 minutes and a quantity of effort that left everyone breathing hard in a way that didn't quite recover before the next obstacle required the same. Orson said nothing. He kept up. Whatever he was thinking, he was keeping it in the same sealed place where Harlan was keeping the particular quality of doubt that said, maybe this is wrong, maybe she's not up here, maybe she's not prepared in the way I'm imagining, maybe I've built a story around her because I needed a story. He pushed the doubt down and kept moving. The timber section above the first slope was better than the open. The trees interrupted the wind, and the snow beneath them was heavy, but not as sculpted into impossible shapes by the wind. Jonas found a way through it that Harlan would not have found on his own, angling left where the instinct was to go straight, cutting to a natural depression in the ridge that channeled them upward in a way that felt almost deliberate, like the mountain had made a decision about where walking was possible. It was in the timber section that Orson fell. Not dramatically. He didn't go over a ledge or lose contact with the world in any significant way. He simply hit a patch of ice under the snow where a buried rock had created a slick surface, and his right foot went out from under him, and he came down on his left knee hard and sat there in the snow with his face doing something private and painful for a moment before he got himself back up. Harlan reached back and offered his hand. Orson took it without making a thing of it. They came out of the timber section onto the upper slope where the cave was supposed to be. Jonas said supposed to be with the honest qualification of a man who was working from a single observation made in better conditions from a different angle. And the slope was a white blank in every direction, and nothing on it resembled an entrance to anything. Just snow and rock faces barely visible through the flying surface drift and the dark shapes of a few trees in the middle distance. Jonas stood at the edge of the timber and looked at the slope with his face doing the specific work of a man trying to match what he remembered to what he was seeing and finding the match harder than he'd hoped. "It's somewhere in that section," he said, lifting his chin toward the rock face to the northeast. "I think." "You think," Caleb said. "I saw her coming down from that direction. That's what I know." Harlan looked at the northeast rock face. It looked like rock face. Like the million other rock faces on this mountain that contained nothing but more rock behind them. He felt the doubt start to climb up from where he'd pushed it, and he pushed it back down again. "All right," he said, "we go that direction." They were 20 meters into the slope when Orson stopped. "Weller," he said. Harlan turned. Orson was pointing at something to the left of their line of travel. Harlan looked and saw nothing, and then looked more carefully and saw movement. Something low to the ground moving toward them through the blowing snow, gray against white, coming fast. For a second, 1 second, his body registered it as something dangerous, some animal driven from its usual shelter by the storm. Something large and moving with purpose toward 4 frozen men on an open slope. Then it slowed, and the shape resolved, and it was the dog. The long-headed gray dog he had seen 100 times at Alolan Pike's heels, moving through Coldwater Hollow with that particular carriage. Unhurried, self-possessed, completely certain of its own navigation. It came to them out of the white, and it stopped about 3 feet from Harlan and looked at him with those pale eyes. And then it turned and looked at the northeast rock face, and then it looked back at him. "Follow it," Jonas said immediately. He had the instincts of a man who had spent real time with working animals and understood what they told you when they told you something. The dog moved. They followed. It led them across the slope at an angle Harlan would not have chosen, avoiding a section that, once they had passed it, he realized was a covered depression that would have swallowed at least 2 of them to the waist. Then up along the base of the rock face where the snow was compressed by the overhang above into something more like ground, where their feet found actual purchase. The dog stopped in front of what looked like solid rock. Harlan stood there looking at it. He put out his hand and touched the face and felt the cold of it under his glove, the absolutely unambiguous solidity of stone. Then something moved. Not the stone, a piece of it, a section that he was suddenly realizing was not continuous with the rest, that was hinged in some way he couldn't immediately identify, that swung inward on a mechanism he couldn't see. Light came out. Not much. A narrow column of warm orange light that hit the blowing snow in front of the entrance and turned it briefly gold. And in the opening stood Alolan Pike. She was holding a short torch, a simple thing, a knot of pine resin bound to a stick, the kind that gave real light without lasting long. She was wearing her buckskin coat with the collar turned up, and her dark hair was down from whatever she usually kept it in, and she was looking at them, all 4 of them, with an expression that Harlan struggled to read and which he later decided had been something like, "I was expecting this, and also I'm not entirely sure I wanted to be right." She looked at Harlan. She looked at Jonas and Caleb. She looked at Orson last, and her face did something very small and carefully controlled when she saw Orson, and then was still again. "How bad is it?" she said. Her voice was even. Not cold exactly, but level in the way that people are level when they have been doing the hard work of staying level for days and have gotten competent at it. "1 roof down," Harlan said. 1 close. Wood piles short. The temperature's not coming up in the daytime." He paused. "Children getting cold. Nestor Birch's place, the chimney's partially blocked, we think, and he can't—" He stopped because the list was long and the cold was still working on him, and he wanted to make the most important point clearly. "We came to see if there's anything—" "How many people can't last another night in their buildings?" Elowen said. She wasn't asking it dramatically. She was asking it the way she asked the price of flour, as a number she needed to do a calculation. Harlan thought. "At least 8. Maybe 12 counting the Calloway children." She nodded once. Not a theatrical nod. Just a nod. Information received and placed. "I've been running the numbers," she said. "I can take 30. It will be tight, and the rations will be strict, but it's survivable. More than 30, I'd need more time to calculate." Orson made a sound. Not a word. Just a sound. Which was the sound a man makes when the ground he has been standing on reveals itself to be a different material than he thought. Elowen glanced at him briefly. Not with heat. Almost with something clinical. "I need you to move," she said, addressing all of them. "Back down, find the people who are in real danger, and start bringing them up." She stepped back from the entrance and held it open. "Come in first. Warm up for 10 minutes, then we'll figure out how to do this." She said "we" as if it were not a complicated word. As if 4 men who had come up a mountain through a blizzard to ask for help from a girl they had dismissed and pitied, and in at least one case publicly humiliated, were simply the people who happened to be available, and the past year of what had happened between them and her were a separate accounting that would be addressed in its own time. Harlan went through the entrance first. The stone was cold under his hands where he had to duck slightly, and then the passage opened and the cold of the mountain began giving way to something else. Not warmth exactly, not at first, but the absence of wind, which after what they had come through felt close to warmth. Then the passage opened further, and the genuine warmth hit him, the warmth of a banked fire in a closed space, and he stopped walking for a second because his body needed a second to accept it. He looked around. He had built things his entire working life. He knew what it meant to join materials carefully, to plan a structure, to maintain it. He looked at the shelves and their contents, the firewood stacked with the specific efficiency of someone who had calculated cubic footage against available space, the sleeping platform elevated from the floor, the apparatus around the spring, the ventilation system whose operation he could see in the way the smoke rose from the small fire and moved toward the ceiling crack without dispersing into the room, the clay urns holding water along the inner wall. He looked at all of it and understood that this had not happened accidentally. This had happened through sustained intelligent labor over an extended period of time, planned and executed with a precision that he could appreciate because he spent his days doing the same thing with metal. Caleb was next through the passage, then Jonas, then Orson. Orson stood in the inner chamber and turned slowly. His face had done the thing that Harlan had expected. The thing that happens to a person's face when they are confronted with evidence that an assumption they have been broadcasting loudly is not only wrong, but comprehensively, systematically, elaborately wrong. He didn't say anything, not yet. Eloan moved past them to the fire and added wood to it in a specific way. 2 pieces, angled, that Harlan now understood was not random. She was managing a burn rate. She was always managing something. "Sit," she said, not rudely, just practically. They sat. Bracken had come back in through the entrance and settled against the wall near the fire with his chin on his paws, watching the 4 men with the calm appraisal of an animal who had seen his person do hard things and trusted her to continue doing them. Eloan handed Harlan a cup of something hot. Water, mostly, with something in it, some dried herbs she had added for warmth, he thought, though he was not the kind of person who knew what herbs did what. It didn't matter. It was hot, and his hands around the cup were shaking slightly from the cold that had gotten through even the wool lining of his second coat. She moved around the chamber with an economy of motion he had not expected. Not rushed, but not wasted either. Not a single extra step. She was preparing things. He couldn't fully track what or in what order, but the impression was of a person executing a plan they had thought through before the need for it arrived. She handed cups to the others. She came to Orson last. She stood in front of him with the cup, and he looked up at her from where he was sitting on the low sleeping platform edge, and something passed between them that the other 3 men in the room felt enough to look away from, as people look away from things that belong to 2 people and not to them. Orson took the cup. His mouth moved. He closed it. His mouth moved again. "I was wrong about you," he said. The words came out with the specific texture of words that have been sitting in a person's chest too long, but rough, unfinished, nothing like the smooth version you would compose if you had time. He hadn't had time. He was saying it here in this firelit cave with his coat dripping snowmelt onto the floor because it was the only moment he had. Eloan looked at him for a moment that was long enough to be honest and short enough to be merciful. "I know," she said. She set her own cup down on the shelf and picked up a coil of rope and looked at Harlan. 10 minutes is almost up," she said. "Tell me exactly which houses in order, and we'll work out how many trips this takes." Harlan set his cup down and straightened. The warmth had done something real to his body in 10 minutes. Not restored it fully, but put enough back that he could think clearly, which was what mattered. He started talking. She listened with the same quality of attention she had always given everything, total, still, and directed at the problem and not at how the problem made her feel. Outside, the storm continued. Inside the mountain, the work of saving Coldwater Hollow began in the most unlikely place it possibly could have. In the home of the girl the settlement had decided was nobody, built by the hands. They had decided were incapable, in the space they had never imagined existed because they had never thought to ask. The first trip down took 40 minutes. It should have taken 25, maybe 30 in decent conditions, but the conditions were not decent, and the trail that Bracken had led them up through had already changed shape since they had come through it. The wind was moving the snow continuously, filling in the compression their boots had made, rebuilding the drifts in the open sections with a patient indifference to their passage. Eloan went first with the dog ranging ahead of her, reading the surface the way he always did, his nose down and his weight distributed carefully, pausing at the places where the snow covered something that wasn't solid ground. She had the rope tied around her waist and the other end tied around Harlan's, and they moved in a chain, the five of them, with enough slack between each person to prevent a single stumble from taking down the whole line, but not so much that the person behind you became invisible in the blowing white. She had her snowshoes on. The wide board frames were ungainly and slowed her in the timber sections where she had to angle her feet carefully between trees. But on the open slopes they kept her from sinking, and in a storm like this, not sinking was the difference between moving and not moving. The men did not have snowshoes. This was a problem she had anticipated and was managing in real time by routing them through the sections where the crust was hardest and the snow most compressed, which meant the longer way around in two places, but the survivable way around in both. Bracken found the route to the settlement's north edge in less time than the trip up had taken despite the conditions. He moved differently going downhill in familiar territory, with more confidence, less checking, trusting his own knowledge of the slope. She watched him and matched her pace to the information his body was giving her. The settlement, when they reached it, was quieter than she had expected. She had been in Coldwater Hollow in all kinds of weather over the past year, but she had never seen it like this. Not shuttered and sealed in the ordinary winter way, but compressed, as if the storm had physically pushed the settlement inward. There were no lights in most of the windows. The few that showed were faint and inconsistent, candle-sized, which meant lamp oil conservation, or exhaustion, or both. The main street was a canyon of drifted snow with one set of tracks in it, older tracks, half-filled, from someone who had gone through hours ago. "Calloway children are at my place," Harlan said from behind her. "That's the obvious first." "How far?" she said. He pointed. She looked at the building and assessed it the way she assessed everything. What was its condition? What did it need? What was the fastest route through the current obstacle field between here and there? The drift situation between where they were standing and the Weller house was manageable with the right line. "Walk behind me exactly," she said. "Put your feet exactly where I put mine. Don't vary." She didn't look back to see if they were doing it. She trusted that men who had just come down a mountain in a blizzard following a gray dog understood the value of instructions by now. Agnes Weller opened the door before they knocked. She had heard them coming, or Bracken had preceded them with some signal that a dog made that humans didn't quite catch. She stepped back from the door, and they came in, and the warmth of the house hit Elowen the way warmth always hit her when she came in from real cold. Not pleasantly at first, but in a wave of almost pain as the circulation in her face and fingers began returning to normal function. The Calloway children were by the fire. The oldest, a girl of maybe 10, was awake and looked at Elowen with an alertness that suggested she had not slept much. The boy and the youngest girl were asleep in a tangle of blankets. Martha Calloway was in a chair beside them, and she looked up when Elowen came in, and her face did the complicated thing that exhausted, frightened people's faces do. When something arrives that might be either salvation or another problem they don't have the resources to deal with. Elowen looked at the children first. She was not a doctor, and she had no formal medical knowledge, but she had spent enough time alone in conditions where reading physical states accurately was survival relevant to have developed a practical eye for it. The sleeping children looked cold-stressed, but not in acute danger. The boy's color was a little off. She would watch that. "We're moving everyone who can't last another night up to my place," she said to Martha. She said it without preamble because preamble cost time, and Martha didn't need it. She needed information. Martha looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at Harlan, as if checking that what she was hearing was what he was confirming. Harlan nodded. Martha looked back at Elowen. "Up the mountain," she said. "It's safer than here and warmer than here, and it has water and food and a fire that won't run out tonight," Elowen said. "You can stay if you believe this building can hold another 2 days. Harlan can give you a more qualified opinion on the roof than I can." Harlan said, "The Weller roof is fine, but it's got 6 people in it now, and our food is going to start being a problem by tomorrow." Martha closed her eyes for 1 second, then opened them. "All right," she said. "All right. How do we carry the little one?" This was the practical problem Elowen had been working on during the walk down. The youngest child, the girl who had been crying the night the roof collapsed, 4 years old, too big to be carried comfortably in arms for a 40-minute mountain traverse in a blizzard, needed some kind of conveyance. She had brought rope. She looked at the blankets and then at the chair Martha was sitting in, which had a solid broad back and 4 sturdy legs. "Harlan," she said, "do you have leather strapping in the shop?" "Some, and a drill." He looked at the chair. He was quick. She had noticed that about him before, the speed with which he saw where a practical problem was going. "Give me 10 minutes, he said. He came back in 8 with leather straps and the drill, and they built together a carrying frame from the chair, back and seat detached from the legs, straps threaded through the slats at the correct intervals to make a carrier that 2 adults could carry between them on poles she found in the woodpile. It was not elegant. The whole thing was a series of compromises between what was needed and what was available in the 10-minute time constraint. But when they laid the sleeping girl in it and wrapped her in the heaviest blanket and tested the carry weight between Jonas and Caleb, it held and it distributed and the child didn't wake up, which was the goal. "The boy walks," Elowen said, looking at him. He was awake now, watching her with the 2 old eyes she had noticed before. "How are your feet?" He looked down at his feet and then back up. "Cold. Do your boots fit tightly?" He nodded. "Good. You'll walk between your mother and me. You stay in my tracks." She looked at him directly, because children, in her experience, responded to being addressed with the same seriousness as adults. "Can you do that?" He thought about it for a moment with what she recognized as genuine consideration rather than automatic agreement. "Yes," he said. "What's your name?" "Samuel." "All right, Samuel, you ready?" He pulled his coat tighter and stood up. "Yes." They went. The trip up was harder than the trip down had been in ways she had anticipated, and one way she hadn't. The anticipated ways. The carrying frame was more awkward uphill than it had been in testing in the Weller kitchen. The cold was working on everyone faster than it would have without the 2 weeks of reduced rations and stress. Everyone in the settlement had been carrying, and the open slope section above the first timberline was blowing harder than it had been an hour ago. The unanticipated way. Orson Vickery, who had not said another word since his 2 sentences in the cave, slipped in the same section of the upper timber where he had fallen before, and this time came down harder. And when he got up and they moved on, she could see from the way he was setting his left foot that something was not right with the knee. Not broken. He was putting weight on it, and his gait was too controlled for the kind of wild adjustment you made around actual bone damage. Badly bruised, most likely, or twisted in the soft tissue. Either way, his speed had changed. She adjusted the line without saying anything about it, put him directly behind Jonas, who was the strongest walker in the group, and moved herself to the back of the line where she could see the pace everyone was keeping and where she would be the last person standing between any straggler and the storm. Samuel, the 7-year-old boy, did not straggle. He walked in her tracks with a focus that she found unexpectedly moving, his small feet landing in her larger footprints with the careful precision of someone who understood that precision mattered here, who had taken what she told him seriously and was executing it without complaint or drama. His mother walked ahead of him, and he kept his eyes on her back, and he did not fall, and he did not slow the line. They got everyone up. That first trip took 45 minutes going up. They unloaded the Calloway family in the inner chamber, got the sleeping girl positioned near the fire, got water into Samuel and his mother, and turned back around. Elowen let herself rest for 4 minutes. She sat on the flat rock with a cup of warm water, and she let her legs know that she acknowledged what they were doing, and then she stood back up and looked at the men. "Who's next?" she said. Harlan had the list in his head. They had worked it out in the cave before the first trip. He had told her the state of each household he'd checked, and she had asked questions he hadn't expected, questions about roof angles and chimney configurations, and how the buildings were oriented relative to the wind direction, which turned out to matter because a building with a blocked chimney on the windward side was a different emergency than one on the leeward side. She had organized the order of priority herself, working through it with the speed and certainty that had made Harlan quiet, in the way people get quiet when they realize they're watching someone operate at a level that makes their own competence feel approximate. The second trip was Nestor Birch and the young couple from the south, the Aldersons, who were in the house nearest Nestor's, and whose combined state was not immediately life-threatening, but whose firewood and food situation was bad enough to become so within a day. Nestor Birch did not want to come. This was not something Elowen had planned for, which she registered as a failure of imagination on her part. She had planned for physical logistics. She had not fully planned for the stubbornness of a man past 70, who had lived in his house for decades and did not see why a blizzard should change that. "I've wintered here 32 years, he said. He was standing in his kitchen with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and the specific dignity of an old man who had very few things left that were entirely his and was not going to give any of them up without a reason that reached him. Harlan opened his mouth. Elowen put her hand up slightly, and he stopped. She looked at Nestor directly. "Your chimney is partially blocked," she said. "You know that." He didn't answer. "So you're burning more wood to get less heat, which means your wood runs out faster." Still nothing. "How much have you got left?" she said. Not a challenge, a question. He looked at her for a long moment. Then his jaw moved. "Enough," he said, but the word had an uncertain edge that the rest of his posture was working hard to cover. "I'm not asking you to leave your home permanently," she said. "I'm asking you to sleep in a place where you won't freeze for 2 days while this storm finishes. Then you come back." She paused. "Can you walk up, or do you need an arm?" There was a silence. Outside the blocked chimney made its thin, persistent sound. "I can walk," Nestor said, and then quieter. "I'll need my coat." She waited while he got it. The Aldersons, by contrast, were ready the moment Harlan knocked. The young wife, Petra, she said her name was, shaking Elowen's hand with a grip that was stronger than expected, and eyes that were sharp with something between relief and mortification, had apparently been discussing the question of going for help for 24 hours and had been arguing in favor of it. Her husband, Thomas, had been the holdout, for reasons that became apparent when he looked at Elowen during the introduction, and his face did the involuntary thing that Elowen had seen on faces her whole life. The brief recalibration, the flicker of something that, in another context, might have been doubt about whether this person, this woman, this size, could be the solution to anything. She watched it pass across his face. She watched him choose, visibly, to set it aside. That visible choice she respected more than if the doubt had never appeared. The choosing said something about him that the automatic reaction didn't. "Can you carry weight?" she said to him. "Yes," he said, with a steadiness that was his answer to his own doubt. "Good. You'll take one end of the frame on the way back." He didn't ask what the frame was. He trusted that he would find out, and that finding out would involve doing something useful, and he was right on both counts. 4 trips total. This was how it went. The second trip brought Nestor Birch and the Aldersons, and also, because they were already at that end of the settlement and Harlan insisted and she agreed with the insistence, 2 families whose roofs she assessed on the way and judged as likely to fail within 12 hours. 6 more people. The cave received them, logged their presence against her count, registered the narrowing margin. 21 people by the end of the second trip. Elowen had set up the outer chamber as a secondary space. Not as warm as the inner chamber, but protected from the wind and from the worst of the cold, adequate for healthy adults with enough blankets. The inner chamber, nearest the fire and the spring, she kept for the children and the elderly and anyone showing signs of cold stress. Agnes Weller had, without being asked, taken charge of the sleeping arrangements in the inner chamber with the same decisive efficiency with which she had taken the Calloway children earlier. She was moving people around and assigning spaces with a practical authority that Elowen found immediately useful and did not interfere with. Martha Calloway was helping distribute water from the clay urns, which was exactly what Elowen would have asked her to do if Martha hadn't already started doing it. Samuel was helping her, moving the smaller cup from person to person with a seriousness that made at least 2 of the adults smile at him in a way he did not seem to notice because he was focused on not spilling. Orson Vickery had sat down against the inner chamber wall with his bad knee extended and was not moving it, which was the correct thing. He was watching everything with an expression she couldn't fully read and didn't try to. She had enough other things to read. The third trip was the hardest. Vladimir Petrov's house was at the far north end of the settlement, which made it the farthest from the mountain trail and the most exposed to the northern wind. By the time they reached it, the wind had shifted slightly, just enough to change the angle of the blowing snow from horizontal to something approaching diagonal from above, which in practical terms meant it was now hitting the underside of your chin when you walked into it, finding the gap between collar and face that no arrangement of wrappings fully closed. Elowen had her chin tucked and her face down, and she was navigating by memory and by Bracken's signal ahead of her, and she was cold in a way she had not been cold in the earlier trips. Not dangerously cold, not yet, but the sustained kind of cold that accumulated over hours of exposure and that her body was now processing into a fatigue that was different from the muscle fatigue of the climbing. It was a heavy fatigue, the kind that told you to stop and sit down, which was advice she had learned to identify as her body being honest about its own limits, and then to overrule anyway. The Petrov family was ready. They had clearly been ready for hours. Vladimir was at the door before they knocked, wearing every piece of warm clothing he appeared to own, and behind him his wife Nadia was organizing two children with the rapid, slightly panicked efficiency of a woman who has been waiting for permission she needed to hear from someone else. "You are the girl from the mountain," Vladimir said. He was looking at her with something she could not immediately categorize. Not doubt, not the recalibration she had seen on Thomas Alderson's face. Something more complicated. Something like an accounting. "Yes," she said. He nodded once, the short, decisive nod of a man filing information. "My wife says we should have come sooner. I said we should not bother." He looked at her steadily. "My wife was right." Elowen didn't have anything useful to add to that. "Let's go," she said. The Petrov children were 6 and 9, both girls, both smaller than she had expected from their parents, who were both large people. The 9-year-old could walk and did, in the line, without complaint. The 6-year-old needed carrying, and Nadia carried her in the way mothers carry children who are too heavy to carry indefinitely, with the particular strength that kicks in when the alternative is unthinkable. They were 2/3 of the way up the mountain when Nadia Petrov's strength reached its limit. She didn't fall. She stopped. Just stopped, mid-slope, and Elowen felt the line go taut behind her and turned, and saw Nadia standing with her daughter still in her arms, but her body making the specific adjustments of a person who has hit a wall. The locked knees, the forward lean, the quality of stillness that was not chosen. Elowen came back down the line to her. She did not say, "Are you all right?" because the answer was visible. She looked at the child in Nadia's arms, and then at Nadia's face, and then she made a decision she would not have been able to make 4 months ago. Not because she lacked the will, but because she lacked the surplus, the extra margin in her own reserves. She had built that margin over a year of careful preparation. She was using it now. "Give her to me," she said. Nadia looked at her. Elowen held out her arms. There was a moment, a long, peculiar moment, where Nadia Petrov, a woman who had never had any reason to trust Elowen Pike, or even to think about her in any sustained way, had to make a decision about whether to hand her child to someone she did not know, on a mountain in a blizzard, based on the evidence she had, which was limited but present. The gray dog sitting 2 feet away in the snow, calm and certain. The men in the line behind her, alive and moving, who had clearly followed this girl up and down this mountain multiple times already. The warmth of the cave at the end of the trail, which Nadia had been in for 10 minutes between trips and which she still felt in her bones as a real, actual thing. She handed the child over. Elowen took the 6-year-old against her left side, adjusted her hold until the weight was manageable. Not comfortable, the girl was solid and limp with sleep, and started back up the slope. She did not think about how heavy the child was. She thought about the next footfall and the one after that. 27 people by the end of the 3rd trip. Bracken had not rested between trips. She had watched him, worrying about it, and then stopped worrying because he was showing her through his behavior that he was fine, still reading the surface, still making the small decisions that kept the line out of trouble. If he had been in distress, she would have known. She knew this animal. But she was tired. The fatigue she had been overruling since the 2nd trip had accumulated into something she could no longer pretend was trivial. Her lower back was doing what it did under extended load, the hot pulsing under her left shoulder blade that she had learned to work through, but which did not, in exchange for being worked through, go politely quiet. It stayed present. It made itself known with each step. She sat in the inner chamber between the 3rd and 4th trips and ate. Not a measured portion. She ate more than her usual, and she didn't feel guilty about it because she had earned the calories and she was going to need them. She ate dried meat and a portion of beans she heated over the fire in the small pan, and she drank 2 full cups of spring water. She sat there with the warmth of too many bodies in a cave around her, and the sounds of children breathing and adults murmuring low conversations in the corners, and she allowed herself exactly this time, the time it took to eat and rehydrate, before she would stand up again. Agnes Weller came and sat beside her. This surprised her. Agnes had been moving non-stop since the first arrivals, a continuous, purposeful motion from one small problem to another, and Elowen had catalogued her as the kind of person who didn't sit down until everything was done, and some things never were. But she came and sat beside Elowen on the flat rock with a cup of her own and didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "How many more?" "One more trip," Elowen said. "3 people, I think. Maybe 4. There's an elderly woman on the east side that Harlan mentioned but wasn't sure about. He's checking before we go back down." Agnes nodded. "The food situation." "I've been calculating it." Elowen looked at the shelves. 8 days at strict ration for 30 people. Maybe 10 if people are reasonable about it. "The storm won't last 10 days. "No," Elowen said. "Probably 2 more, maybe 3. But I'm calculating for 10 because if I'm wrong, I want to be wrong in the safe direction." Agnes was quiet for a moment. "You think like that naturally," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "I learned to," Elowen said. Agnes looked at her with the particular directness of a woman past 50 who had decided somewhere in her life that looking at things directly was more efficient than not. "Harlan told me what Orson said to you. In the store. What he said about—" She stopped, chose different words. "The things he said over the past year." Elowen finished her beans. "I'm not going to make a speech about it," Agnes said. "I just want to say that I heard what he said to you when you opened the door. And I know that doesn't fix it, but I wanted you to know I heard it." Elowen set down the pan. She looked at the fire for a moment. "I'm not carrying it right now," she said. "There's too much else to carry." Agnes nodded like this was the most sensible thing she had heard in days. "Then I won't add to the pile," she said, and stood up and went back to being useful. Harlan came through the inner chamber passage at the edge of Elowen's eating time. He looked at her with the slightly cautious expression of a man about to report something he's not sure will be well received. "The elderly woman on the east side," he said. "How bad?" "She's fine. Roof is solid, chimney's clear, wood is stocked. She's fine, and she knows it. And she's also—" He paused. "She's something. She asked me if the girl from the mountain had sent me, and when I said yes, she said, and I am telling you this accurately, that she had been expecting someone sensible to show up eventually." Elowen blinked. "Then she asked if the stores in the cave included dried apricots because she had some she'd been saving and she'd like to bring them if there was room." Elowen stood up. "Tell her yes," she said, "and tell her to bring them with her if she wants to come. But she doesn't have to." The old woman, her name was Cecile Granger, and she was 74 and had been in the Hollow longer than almost anyone, long enough to have developed opinions about everything, including the quality of other people's preparedness, came on the 4th trip. She brought the dried apricots in a cloth sack, and she walked the entire mountain trail with a staff she had clearly been using for years, and a pace that suggested she had spent sufficient time on mountain terrain to understand it. When she came through the cave entrance and looked around the inner chamber, she said, in a tone that communicated that she had had a hypothesis and it had been confirmed. She set the apricots on a shelf and found a space near the fire and sat down and took off her outer coat with the calm efficiency of a woman attending a long-anticipated but delayed gathering. 28 people. Elowen stood in the outer chamber doing the count. 28 in a space she had built for one that she had slowly, carefully, over a year of deliberate labor, expanded into something that could hold more. Every shelf of food, every stacked piece of firewood, every clay urn filled from the spring. She had built it around a promise she had made to herself at an age when she should not have had to make promises to herself. She had built it in solitude and in the specific knowledge that solitude would not last forever, even if she had not known exactly what form its ending would take. This was the form. 28 people breathing her air, drinking her water, warming themselves at her fire. Children she didn't know asleep on blankets she had laid down with her own hands. Old Nestor Birch asleep against the wall with his arms folded and his jaw working slightly, the way old men's jaws worked when they were thinking in their sleep. Orson Vickery still awake against the other wall, watching. When she came into the inner chamber and moved to check the fire, he spoke. "Why?" he said. Not loudly, just the word. She looked at him. "You could have told us to work it out ourselves," he said. "You could have stayed up here. You would have been fine." He looked at the people around him. "Why come down?" She looked at the fire for a moment. She thought about the calculation she had run 3 days ago in this same chamber, the one about how many people the cave could hold. She thought about the Calloway children asleep near the fire and Samuel's feet placed precisely in her footprints up the mountain. She thought about the winter she did not talk about, the one that had built this place, the one that had cost her more than she would say to most people, and that had also, in a way she had never quite resolved with herself, given her the one thing she had ever really built her life on, the certainty that preparation was not paranoia, that taking the danger seriously was not weakness, that knowing exactly where your water came from and how long your food would last, and whether your roof would hold was not excessive. It was just what you did if you were paying attention. "Because I could," she said. He looked at her. "And because I know what it feels like," she said, "to need something and have nobody come." The fire moved between them. Outside, the storm pushed at the mountain with the same steady pressure it had maintained for 3 days, enormous and cold and wholly indifferent to what was happening inside the rock. Inside the rock, 28 people were alive because one girl had spent a year building a place where they could be. Harlan was awake in the outer chamber, sitting against the wall with his back straight and his eyes open in the dark. When she came through the passage, he looked at her. "Last head count," she said. 28. 29, he said. She looked at him. He tilted his head toward the passage. "Agnes is in there. She wasn't going to stay at the house alone." Elowen counted again in her head. 29. Against her projected maximum of 30. One slot left in the math, one margin of safety she had built in and had not needed to use. "All right," she said. She sat down against the wall opposite him. Bracken came and lay down with his back against her leg. His whole body pressed along her shin the way he pressed against her in the cold, giving and taking warmth simultaneously. "You should sleep," Harlan said. "I know," she said. She didn't yet. She sat in the outer chamber in the dark with the dog against her leg and the sounds of 29 people breathing on the other side of the passage wall, and she thought about the morning and what it would require, and she calculated and she planned, because that was what she did, and it had never failed her yet, and it was not going to fail her now. She slept 4 hours. Not because 4 hours was enough, it wasn't, and her body told her so clearly when she came back up from it, the particular heaviness behind her eyes that meant the debt had not been paid, only deferred. But because 4 hours was what she allowed herself, and then she was awake, and calculating again before she had fully registered being conscious. The fire in the inner chamber had dropped while she slept. Not dangerously, not to the point of real heat loss, but lower than her target maintenance level. She fed it without waking anyone, moving in the dark with the practiced quiet of a person who had spent a year moving around a cave without disturbing a sleeping dog. 2 pieces angled the way she had learned made the most efficient catch. She crouched there watching the flame take hold and spread and felt something she didn't immediately name, some quality of the moment pressing against her differently than the practical requirements of the moment usually did. 29 people breathing around her in the dark. She listened to it, the irregular rhythm of it, the small sounds. Someone shifting against the stone floor, a child making a soft, indistinct sound that wasn't quite waking, old Nestor Birch whose breathing had a low catch in it on every 3rd or 4th exhale that she was going to keep monitoring. All of it layered together into something she had no word for, something that was the opposite of the silence she had been living in for a year. Not better than the silence, exactly. She was honest with herself about that. The silence had been her own. This was something else, something that had a weight and a heat and a complication to it that the silence never did. She sat by the fire until the chamber was back to temperature. Then she went through to the outer chamber and ate her measured breakfast in the dark, alone, while Bracken sat beside her and the sounds of the storm came through the mountain above them, muffled, distant seeming, like something happening in another world. The storm sounded different. She sat still and listened more carefully. It took her a minute to identify what was different, because the difference was in the quality of what was absent rather than what was present. The deep subsonic pressure she had been feeling in her chest for 3 days, that geological pushing, the storm asserting its weight against the mountain, was lighter. Still there, but lighter. She went to the entrance and opened it 2 inches and looked out. The wind had dropped, not stopped. The snow was still moving, still blowing, but the sustained violence of it had eased. The surface drift that had been near horizontal for 3 days was falling at something closer to an angle. The air coming through the gap was brutally cold, but not the brutal cold of a storm at full force. Something had changed in the pressure system driving the whole thing. She closed the entrance and went back to the fire. By her estimate, based on everything she had read in the mountain and the sky and bracken over the previous week, the storm had spent the largest part of its force. What remained was what remained. And in the mountains that could still be dangerous, could still kill someone careless or unprepared, but the worst of it was behind them. Which meant that what was behind them, specifically, was 3 days of a storm that had done what she had calculated it would do, moving through Coldwater Hollow with a comprehensive lack of mercy for every shortcut and deferred maintenance decision and comfortable assumption the settlement had accumulated over its years of ordinary winters. She started thinking about the morning, not her morning, the settlement's morning, what they were going to find when they went back down. She did not do this with satisfaction. She was careful about that, careful with herself, the way she was careful about what she ate and how much. Satisfaction at the settlement's damage felt like something she could not afford, not because it was wrong to feel it. She was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that some part of her had a legitimate accounting with Coldwater Hollow, but because it was useless. It didn't help with what came next, and what came next was substantial. The inner chamber began waking up as the fire brightened. Children first, as always. The youngest Calloway girl sat up from her blankets with the complete and serious alertness of a 4-year-old in an unfamiliar place, looked around the cave with enormous eyes, and then found her mother's arm and pulled it toward her without a word. Martha Calloway was awake within seconds, the hair-trigger waking of a mother with small children, and gathered the girl in without making a production of it. Samuel was awake next. He came immediately to Eloan. "Is it over?" he said. He meant the storm. "Not entirely," she said, "but the worst part is." He processed this with the same genuine consideration he applied to everything. "Can I help with something?" She looked at him, 7 years old, earnest, standing in a firelit cave at whatever hour of the early morning this was, asking to be useful. She thought about the version of herself at 7, not exactly the same circumstances, but close enough in the ways that mattered, and felt something move in her chest that she pushed back down because this was not the time. "The water," she said. "I'm going to start heating some for people. You can help me carry cups when they're ready." He nodded like he'd been waiting for a real job. People woke in stages over the next hour. The cave had its own particular logic for this. The fire drew everyone toward it gradually, the way light draws people in the dark, and the warmth made waking easier than it might have been. Eloan had water heating and a portion of beans on the small pan, and she was calculating rations for 29 people against what remained on the shelves, and doing it with one part of her mind, while the other parts managed the immediate logistics of too many people in a small space. Agnes Weller materialized at her elbow within 10 minutes of waking, as if the woman's body simply defaulted to useful before it was fully conscious. "Tell me what to do," Agnes said. Eloan told her. They worked in tandem, she and Agnes, in a way that happened without discussion, and that both of them seemed to understand without needing to name it. Agnes managed the distribution of food and water with the same organized authority she had applied to the sleeping arrangements the night before. Eloan managed the fire and the supply accounting and the larger picture of how long what they had would last and at what rate. The cave was loud in a way it had never been loud. This was the only word for it. Loud with the specific sound of too many people in a space that had been designed for one. The overlapping conversations, and the children's voices, and the movements and requests, and the ordinary human noise of people who had been frightened and were now in the early stages of being less frightened and were processing that transition with their voices. Eloan found it was easier to stand slightly outside the main cluster of it. Not because she was unfriendly. She answered questions when asked, gave information when it was needed, directed people when they needed directing. But because she needed some perimeter of quiet to keep her calculations running, and too much noise too close collapsed that perimeter and made her feel something she could only describe as scrambled. Bracken stayed close to her. He had the dog's instinct for managing his own space in a crowd without being aggressive about it. A certain way of positioning himself that communicated, "This is my radius," without confrontation. She watched him doing it and thought that it was a skill she had imperfectly developed in herself over the past year. Cecile Granger, 74 years old, and apparently impervious to the category of discomfort that afflicted everyone else, was awake early and drinking her water with the air of someone at a gathering they had organized themselves. She caught Elowen's eye from across the inner chamber and held it for a moment with a look that communicated something Elowen filed and didn't examine yet. It was mid-morning when Harlan came to her with the question she had been waiting for. "When do we go back down to look?" he said. She had been sitting with this question herself for 2 hours. The answer required balancing things that were in tension with each other. The genuine danger still present on the mountain against the genuine necessity of understanding what the settlement needed in terms of response. The risk of sending people back down too soon against the risk of waiting too long and having something develop in the empty buildings that made the recovery harder. "This afternoon," she said, "when the wind drops further. I'll go first with Bracken and assess the trail conditions. Then you and Jonas come with me to look at the buildings before dark." He nodded. "The others stay here," she said. "I don't want anyone on the mountain who doesn't need to be. The trail is manageable, but it's not safe for everyone." He didn't argue with this. She had noticed that Harlan did not argue with her assessments when they were based on the mountain, which told her something about the quality of his attention during the previous 24 hours. The afternoon went the way she had estimated. The wind dropped steadily through midday. By early afternoon, it was enough reduced that when she opened the entrance and looked out, the snow was falling nearly straight down, which was a thing the snow had not done in 3 days. The temperature was still brutal, the deep cold of a storm's aftermath, the kind that settled in once the wind stopped carrying the air and let it simply sit and freeze. But the mountain was traversable in a way it had not been. She went down first with Bracken, as she'd said. She went quickly, alone, reading the trail conditions without the complications of managing other people around them. And what she found was this. The trail was damaged in 2 sections where the wind had deposited snow against natural funnels and created drifts that would require navigation rather than simple walking, but it was not impassable. And the worst of the ice that had formed on the first open slope during the freezing rain 3 days ago had been covered by enough subsequent dry snow to give traction. Bracken moved through it like water moving through a channel, finding the path of least resistance not by knowing the answer in advance, but by reading each step as it came. She was at the settlement's north edge in 35 minutes. What she found there she looked at steadily, without hurrying the looking, because what you saw when you first looked at a thing was information you only got once. Coldwater Hollow was altered. The Callaway house was the most visible damage. The collapsed center section had filled overnight with snow, and the remaining standing walls gave the building the appearance of a ruin from something older and more historical than 3 days of bad weather. But it was not the only damaged structure. The Miller Addition roof had come down, as Harlan had predicted, at some point during the night. She could see the collapse from 30 meters away, the inward fold of the boards, the snow filling the gap. 2 other buildings showed visible damage to their roof lines that would require immediate assessment before anyone went inside them. The main street was buried under drifts that in places came up past a standing person's hip. The community woodpile at the mill yard was covered completely, a white mound with no visible timber face. The creek that ran along the settlement's eastern edge had frozen solid, which happened in hard winters, but which would complicate the spring water situation once people were back in their homes. She walked the whole settlement before Harlan and Jonas arrived. All of it, every street, every building exterior she could access. She was making a list in her head, not an emotional list, not an "isn't this terrible" list, but a practical inventory of what needed doing in what order and what resources that required and where those resources would come from. It was a long list. Harlan and Jonas came down an hour after she did. They found her at the east end of the settlement, standing in front of a building whose chimney had partially collapsed outward at the top. A clean structural failure, nothing dangerous at ground level, but the chimney would need to be rebuilt before the building was habitable again. Harlan stood beside her and looked at it. "How bad overall?" he said. She told him what she had seen. She was specific, and she did not soften anything because softening it helped no one. 2 buildings with collapsed roof sections that were total losses for the remainder of the winter. 4 with damaged roof lines that were repairable but needed immediate attention. The community woodpile would need excavation before assessment. The frozen creek was a complication, but not a crisis. There were several wells in the settlement she had checked, and 2 of them appeared accessible. Jonas listened with his arms crossed and his jaw working slightly. He was a man who processed things physically. She could see him translating what she said into physical tasks, assigning his own body to them one by one. "The Callaway house," he said. There's no saving what's there for this winter. No, she said. That family needs somewhere to be until spring. They can stay with us, Harlan said, and then modified it. They can stay with whoever has the space and the structure. That's a conversation for everyone together, she said. Not one we need to have on a street in the cold. She looked at the settlement around her, the empty, altered, snow-pressed version of the place that had watched her walk through it for a year with the comfortable certainty that she was the problem in the picture. She looked at it without hatred and without tenderness, which was, she had come to understand, probably the most honest she had ever managed to feel about it. It was a place. It had people in it who were various mixtures of good and frightened and small-minded and brave, frequently in the same person, frequently in the same hour. It had failed her in specific ways that had cost her specific things. It had also, through Harlan's willingness to push himself up a mountain in a blizzard, and through Agnes's immediate and unreflective competence, and through Samuel walking in her exact footprints without being told twice, shown her something she had not let herself expect. She had not let herself expect anything from Coldwater Hollow, because expecting things from it had not historically paid for itself. She was revising the calculation. They went back up in the late afternoon while there was still enough light to navigate by. Harlan and Jonas went first, carrying news of what they'd seen back to the cave. Elowen made one more circuit of the settlement's exterior before she followed, marking in her head the specific repairs that were most urgent and which of the materials for those repairs were already in the settlement versus what would need to be sourced. When she came back through the cave entrance, the inner chamber had shifted in its atmosphere. The information had traveled, because information always traveled fastest in small enclosed spaces with 29 people in them, and the mood had changed from cautious relief to something more complicated. She could hear it in the pitch of the conversations, the undercurrent of anxiety that had a different quality than the storm anxiety. The storm had been a known terrible thing. What came after it was still being defined. She went to the center of the inner chamber and waited until people registered her presence there. It took about 30 seconds. The conversations dropped to background level. She told them what she had seen, the same specific, unsoftened account she had given Harlan on the street. She watched faces as she went through it. The Calloway children's mother, who went still when Elowen confirmed what she had probably known, that the house was not recoverable for this winter. The Petrovs, whose faces showed the relief of people whose house she had been able to tell them was structurally intact. Nestor Birch, who asked about the chimney on his house specifically, and to whom she gave a specific answer, which was that the chimney appeared intact from the outside, and she had not been inside, but she would check it in the morning. "So what do we do?" someone said. She didn't see who. "You rebuild," she said, "the same way people always rebuild after something like this, but differently than before because before wasn't working." Silence. "There are things I can show you," she said, "roof structures that bear snow load differently, chimney configurations that don't block, how to maintain a community wood supply that is actually sufficient for a bad winter instead of an average one, how to read what the mountain is telling you about what kind of winter is coming." She paused. "These are not complicated things. They are things that require paying attention and taking the possibility of the worst case seriously before it arrives." More silence. A different quality of silence this time. "The Calloway family needs a place this winter," she said. "That's the first conversation. After that, the repairs, in the order I'll outline, starting with the two buildings that need the most immediate attention before we can use them for anything." She stopped. She was not a person who made speeches, and she had not made one now. It had been information, organized and delivered. But the room had the feeling of people receiving something that was more than information, and she was aware of that without quite knowing what to do with it. Cecile Granger's voice came from the corner. "I have the room," she said, about the Calloway family. "I have always had the room. Martha knows she is welcome." Martha Calloway looked at the old woman. Something passed between them that Elowen didn't try to decode. "Thank you, Cecile," Martha said. Her voice was steady in the way that voices are steady when you are working hard to keep them that way. "Don't thank me," Cecile said. "I want someone to talk to during the second half of the winter. Those children can be my excuse." She said it in the tone of a woman who had decided to reframe a generous act as a selfish one to relieve the recipient of obligation, and Elowen recognized the tactic and respected it. The Petrov family would share the heating load with the young Aldersons, whose building was intact but whose woodpile needed supplementing. Jonas Mack volunteered his own surplus wood. He had stocked heavily in October, which he said without pride or display, just factually, and which landed in the room with a particular quality of usefulness. Two other households offered space and resources in the careful, slightly awkward way that people offer things when they are not certain how the offer will be received, when generosity is new enough between them that it doesn't quite have a practiced shape yet. Harlan spoke last. He stood near the fire with his large hands at his sides, and he looked at the group of people in the cave, and then he looked at Elowin. "This past year," he said, and stopped. He tried again. "Most of us made a judgment about this person." He didn't editorialize, he just named it. "We were wrong, specifically wrong, not just generally wrong. She saw what was coming, and she had built the thing that saved us, and we had decided she was someone who couldn't survive alone. That's worth sitting with." He paused again. "I just think it's worth naming plainly, so we don't let it become comfortable by not naming it." The cave was quiet. The fire moved. Outside, the snow fell straight down through the dark. Orson Vickery, who had not spoken since the morning, said, "I was the loudest one," in case that needs saying specifically. Nobody argued with that assessment. Nobody pile-on agreed with it either. The room did what rooms sometimes do when something honest has been said that everyone needed said, and nobody wants to cheapen it by responding immediately. It held it for a moment. Elowin stood near the entrance passage with Bracken against her leg, and she felt the weight of the moment the way she sometimes felt the weight of the mountain above her when she was in the deepest chamber. Not as oppression, but as presence. Something real and pressing that had to be acknowledged. "It's done," she said. "What I need from everyone is what you can do for the next week. That's the only accounting I'm interested in." She meant it. This was not grace performed for an audience. It was a practical position based on a practical understanding, which was that what Coldwater Hollow had done to her in the past was a closed set of events, and what it did in the next week was an open one. She had learned early that staying inside the closed set was a way of giving the past more of your present than it had earned. She was not, she would have been honest about this, entirely finished with the accounting. There were things she would carry about Orson Vickery and about Mrs. Aldridge and about the 100 small moments of a year of being seen as nothing by people who were looking directly at her. She would carry them. People carried things. The question was what you did with them. What she had done, apparently, was build a mountain shelter that could hold 30 people. She went to sleep that night with the weight of 29 people's breathing around her, and it did not feel the same as the previous nights. Something had moved. Not resolved, not neatly concluded. She was too honest with herself for neat conclusions. But moved, the way a stone moves when enough water has passed over it. She was still herself. The cave was still the cave. But the relationship between her and the people on the other side of the passage wall was not the same structure it had been a year ago, and she could feel the difference even in the dark. The storm broke on the second morning. She knew it before she checked. She felt it in her sleep, some change in the mountain's atmosphere that reached her without needing to pass through waking consciousness first. She was at the entrance before anyone else stirred, and she opened it and looked out at a world that was white and silent and still. And the sky above the white was the particular blue that follows a storm. The blue that is so saturated it almost seems artificial, so clean it seems like something that has to be earned. The cold was immense. Storms left cold behind them the way water left mud. The primary violence was over, but the secondary conditions were their own challenge. But the sky was clear and the snow had stopped and the mountain was visible in every direction, the ridgelines sharp against the blue, the timber dark and white-loaded, the settlement below visible as a collection of white shapes with smoke beginning to rise from the ones that had functioning chimneys. She stood in the entrance for a few minutes. Bracken sat beside her, looking at the same landscape. She thought about the first morning she had stood here, a year and a week ago, after the matron at the orphan house had told her there was no room. She had stood here in the early light with her canvas pack and her worn-through boot, and the entire prospect of the mountain in front of her, and she had felt, not optimistic, not brave, nothing so clean as either of those, she had felt stubborn. A specific deep stubbornness that was the refusal of a person to be what other people's dismissal of them required them to be. She had refused to be helpless. She had refused quietly, with no audience, over the course of an entire year, one piece of firewood and one jar of flour and one stone shelf at a time. And now, she did not finish the thought. Some thoughts completed themselves in actions rather than words. The descent that morning was organized in the most complicated piece of logistics the rescue operation had required. 29 people down a mountain trail in cold conditions, with varying physical capabilities and varying degrees of anxiety about what they were going back to. She split them into 3 groups with different pacing requirements, assigned Harlan to lead the first group and Jonas the second, took the third herself with the people who needed the most careful management, the elderly, the young children, Orson with his knee, Nestor Birch with his staff. Cecile Granger walked with the third group and talked the entire time. This was not, Elowen came to understand, nervousness or filling silence for its own sake. It was Cecile's method of managing a group, keeping people connected to a voice, keeping their attention occupied with something other than their feet and their fear, maintaining a social thread through terrain that otherwise contracted everyone into their own private anxiety. She had clearly been doing this for decades. She was very good at it. Elowen found she did not need to manage the third group at all. Cecile was managing it. She concentrated on the trail. They reached the settlement by mid-morning. Watching people walk back into Coldwater Hollow after what had happened was something Elowen stood slightly apart from, the way she had stood slightly apart from most things, and watched. It was not a triumphant return. It was too complicated for that, the damage too visible, the cold too present. People walked back to their houses, and some found them intact, and some found damage they had not yet processed the shape of. And there were moments of distress she observed from a respectful distance, and moments of relief that looked almost violent in their intensity, the way relief looks when it has been held back long enough. The Calloway house. Martha stopped in front of it for a long time. The 2 older children stood beside her. The youngest was on Cecile's hip somehow, which was where she had been for the last 20 minutes of the walk, having migrated there without any apparent decision being made by either party. Elowen went to stand beside Martha. She didn't say anything. Sometimes standing beside someone was the thing, and anything added to it was subtraction. Martha looked at the collapsed roof for a long time. Then she said, "We'll build it back." Yes, Elowen said. "In the spring. Better." "I can help with the design," Elowen said. "The roof angle, the beam specifications, if you want." Martha looked at her, something in her face that Elowen didn't try to name because it was too full. "I would want that very much," she said. The work began that same afternoon. Not the full rebuilding. That was weeks away. That was spring and lumber, and the kind of sustained collective effort that required planning she would help with. The immediate work was the urgent triage. The 2 buildings with structurally compromised roof sections needed their snow loads managed before anything else. The accessible wells needed to be identified and marked for community use. The community woodpile needed excavation to understand what was actually there. And the 2 families who could not return to their primary buildings needed their temporary arrangements confirmed and made functional. She organized it. Not by appointing herself in charge. She was clear in her own head that she was not the person who should be in charge of Coldwater Hollow in any permanent or administrative sense, which was a different kind of role entirely, and one she did not want. But in the way that someone who knows what needs doing next finds herself saying what needs doing next, which is different, and which she was honest about. Harlan ran the structural assessments. Jonas and Thomas Alderson, and 2 other men whose names she was learning, Caleb she already knew, and a younger man named Reed, who was faster and more capable than his age, suggested, worked on the snow load management and the woodpile excavation. Orson Vickery, with his bad knee, could not do heavy outdoor work. He could stand in his store and manage supply distribution, which was what he had to offer, and he offered it without being asked, simply opened the store and started accounting for what was there and what people needed. She saw him doing it from across the street and filed it. Nadia Petrov organized the women and older children into a supply chain for hot water and food distribution, using the 2 houses with the most functional hearths as staging points. Elowen gave her the instructions for what she was doing with the fire management, and Nadia absorbed them quickly and then improved on the distribution logistics in a way that Elowen had not thought of, and she said so. "My mother ran a supply depot during a flood when I was 12, Nadia said, by way of explanation. "Show me what you're doing," Elowen said. She learned something that afternoon. She was not in the habit of acknowledging when she learned something from people who had previously not been in a position to teach her anything, but she was honest with herself. And Nadia Petrov's instinct for supply logistics was genuinely better than hers in the specific area of human distribution, moving things to people rather than managing things in a fixed location. These were related but different skills. The settlement did not rebuild in a day. This needs to be said plainly, because the story of it is not the story of a single triumphant afternoon where everything came together. It is the story of 5 days of cold, grinding, imperfect, frequently frustrating work during which things went wrong, at the rate that things always go wrong when too many people are working on too many problems in bad conditions with inadequate resources. The first attempt at clearing the community woodpile revealed that more of it was wet than anyone had hoped. Ice had penetrated the stack during the freezing rain, and wood that looked viable on the surface was unusable underneath. This created a resource gap that had to be addressed by going back to individual household stores and doing a collective accounting that required more time and more uncomfortable conversations than the abstract idea of sharing resources had prepared people for. Two men argued about whose responsibility it was to repair a shared fence between their properties that the storm had destroyed. The argument was disproportionate to the fence because it was not actually about the fence, and Elowen was close enough to hear it and far enough away to not be required to involve herself, which was where she stayed. A chimney reconstruction on the Birch property, Harlan's assessment confirmed the damage was repairable, stalled for half a day because the mortar mix was wrong and the stones were setting crooked. She came to look at it because Harlan asked her to, looked at the mortar, identified the clay-to-sand ratio as the problem, and suggested a correction that worked. Harlan looked at her. "Where did you learn masonry?" he said. "I had a year," she said. He shook his head in a way that was not negative, something more like a person recalibrating a scale they didn't know was off. On the third day after the storm broke, she was up on the slope above the cave cutting timber. Her own firewood reserves had been significantly reduced by 3 days of a much larger fire than she normally maintained, and she needed to rebuild the supply before the next cold spell, which the mountain's current behavior suggested was coming within a week, when she heard someone on the trail below. She waited, hand on the axe. It was Samuel. He came up the slope in a straight line, not following the easier angled path, which was the path he should have been following, but heading directly for her with the single-minded approach of someone who has decided to arrive somewhere and is not interested in the scenic route. He was breathing hard by the time he reached her, and he did not apologize for it or comment on it. "My mother sent something," he said. He held out a cloth bundle. She took it. It was warm against her hands in a way she hadn't expected. Something had been baked that morning, wrapped in cloth still holding the heat. She looked at him. "She made extra," he said. She said to say thank you, but she didn't want to just say it in words. She wanted to say it in the thing. Elowen looked at the bundle for a moment. She thought about Martha Calloway standing in front of the collapsed house, saying we'll build it back with the same tone Elowen had used 100 times to herself in the first months on the mountain. The tone that was not confidence exactly, but the decision to behave as if confidence were available. "Tell her she's welcome," she said. Samuel looked at the axe and the timber she had been cutting. "Can I help?" he said. She looked at him. He was 7. He was not going to be useful with an axe. But he was here, and he had asked, and she thought about herself at 7, at the edge of a winter that had taught her everything, and what she would have needed to be told. "You can stack," she said. "I'll cut you stack. The pieces need to be fitted like this." She showed him with 2 pieces of timber, the way the angles of the cuts created interlocking support, the way certain orientations made the stack stable and others made it want to fall. He watched with his full attention, and then he started stacking. He did it correctly on the second try. She cut timber and he stacked, and the mountain was quiet around them in the way mountains are quiet after a storm, that particular post-storm silence that felt both emptied and full. All the violent sound used up, what remained a kind of attentive stillness. Bracken moved between them, investigating the cut sections with his nose, performing some assessment of the wood that only made sense to him. On the 5th day, Orson Vickery came up the mountain. She saw him coming from above, recognizable by his gait, which was still slightly compensated on the left from the knee. Not badly, the knee had improved, but enough that she could identify him from a distance. I was alone. He was carrying something. She went to the entrance and waited. He came up the slope more carefully than he would have a week ago, more attentively, reading the surface in a way that suggested the mountain had taught him something about itself. He reached the entrance and stopped and looked at her. He was carrying a piece of cloth, folded. He held it out. She took it. It was a length of good wool, dark blue, the kind she had seen in his store and had never bought because the price was beyond what she could justify against her actual needs. Enough for a coat, or close to it. "My best cloth," he said. "I know it doesn't—" He stopped. "I know it doesn't fix anything. I'm not giving it to you because I think it fixes anything." She waited. "I'm giving it to you because I want to do something real," he said. "Not just say the words. I said the words in there and I meant them, but I want to do something that costs me something." She looked at the cloth. There was a version of this where she handed it back, where the gesture and the intention and the discomfort on his face were not enough, would never be enough, where a year of cruelty and public humiliation had built a debt that blue wool did not service. That version existed, and she was honest enough to acknowledge it. There was also this version, a man standing on a mountain he had climbed on a bad knee with good cloth in his hands, trying to make a cost-him-something gesture because he understood, at some level that had been reached by 3 days in a cave with 28 other people and a girl he had mocked, that what he had done had a weight that words discharged poorly. She took the cloth. "Come in for a few minutes," she said. "You look cold." He came in. She made water hot and gave him a cup, and he sat on the flat rock that was her chair and looked around the cave the way Harlan had looked the first time, taking it in properly, without the emergency overlay of that first night. He looked at the shelves, the system, the way everything was placed with intention. "You built all of this yourself," he said. Not a question. "Yes. In a year. Most of it in the first 6 months, the rest was refinement." He drank his water. "I said you'd be crawling back to town by first snow." "I remember. I said it loud enough for other people to hear on purpose." "I know. I don't know why I did that," he said. "I've been trying to understand it for a week, and I don't have an answer that satisfies me." She thought about this for a moment. She thought about Mrs. Aldridge and the orphan house door closing and the thin strip of light underneath it that was the last thing she had seen before she turned and walked away. She thought about the specific mechanism by which people made themselves comfortable with treating others as less than they were, the way it required a sustained work of not looking that became habitual. "Some people need someone to be below them," she said. "It doesn't have anything to do with the person they pick." Orson looked at his cup. "But it does have consequences for the person they pick," she said. "That's the part that's yours to carry." He nodded. Didn't argue. Didn't seek exoneration. She gave him credit for not seeking exoneration. He left after a while. He went back down the mountain on his recovering knee without being asked to carry anything except what she had said, which was specific and honest and probably not comfortable. She stood at the entrance and watched him go. Bracken sat beside her. She looked out at the settlement below, the smoke rising from more chimneys than had been functioning a week ago, the small moving shapes of people in the streets doing the work of getting back to ordinary life. The ordinary life was different now than it had been. She could see that even from here, in the way the activity was organized, less solitary, more collective, people moving in clusters rather than in the sealed individual units they had operated in before the storm. She did not know if that would last. She was too honest to predict it would. People regressed. Communities that bonded under emergency dissolved back into their ordinary frictions once the emergency passed. She had seen enough of human behavior over 18 years, even mostly solitary human behavior viewed from a distance, to understand that the storm was not a permanent cure for anything. But something had shifted. Some plate beneath the surface had moved. She could feel it in the way people spoke to her now when she came down the mountain, in the way they listened when she said something about the weather or the timber, or what the creek level suggested about the coming weeks. They heard her differently. Not perfectly. There were still people in Coldwater Hollow who looked at her the way they had always looked at her, with that evaluating glance that started at her size and ended before it got to much else. That had not been erased by a blizzard, but it had been complicated, and complicating it was enough to work with. She turned back to the mountain, her mountain, the one she had built a year of herself into, the one that had held 29 people against the worst storm in a decade and returned them to their lives. The spring in the back chamber was running its ordinary clear cold water. The firewood supply was down from its peak, but still substantial. The shelves needed replenishment, which would happen gradually over the coming months through the same methodical trading and hunting and preserving that had built them in the first place. There was much to do. There was always much to do. This was not a burden she chafed against. It was the texture of the life she had built, the life that had been built by necessity into something she would not now trade. She was Aloan Pike. She was 18 years old. She was a very plus-sized young woman with a lean gray dog and a mountain and a cave full of spring water and firewood and 8 months of provisions, and she had just spent a week saving the people who had told her she couldn't save herself. She had not done it for the redemption of it. She had done it because she could, and because she knew what it felt like to need something and have nobody come, and because the promise she had made to herself, the one she had made in the worst winter of her life, when she was young and alone and cold and terrified, that promise had never been just about her. She had thought it was, in the beginning. She had built for one because one was what she had. But the spring was larger than one person needed. The firewood alcove was larger than one person needed. The cave had chambers she hadn't touched yet. She had been building for 30 people and not known it. She went back inside. The fire was exactly where she had left it. She added one piece of wood, the right size, the right angle, the right position to extend the burn without wasting it. Outside, the mountain settled into its winter quiet, and the smoke from Coldwater Hollow's chimneys rose straight up into the clear, cold air, and Aloan Pike sat by her fire and listened to the spring run in the back chamber.